There's visions of dragons. There's visions of this golden hill, which is like square and has the tree of blood on it. It has the 4 evangelists barefoot and looking very angelic as well.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are discussing an excellent book of the Art of Magicke with author, historian, poet, and practicing magician, Dr. Alexander Cummins. Listeners, if you haven't already, I would definitely check out the previous appearances of Dr. Cummins on Glitch Bottle, where he shares a plethora of wisdom on a variety of magical, esoteric, and Solomonic-themed topics, and so much more. And in this episode, we're discussing one of the latest releases from Scarlet Imprint. It's entitled An Excellent Booke of the Art of Magicke, the magical works of Humphrey Gilbert and John Davies. Now, this incredible tome details the records of Elizabethan explorer and soldier Humphrey Gilbert, along with his scryer, John Davies, and they both used forceful methods and stripped-down Protestant ritual to work with spirits during the spring of 1567. An Excellent Booke was transcribed from British Library Additional Manuscript 36674 and was edited and introduced by Phil Legard with supplementary essays by Dr. Cummins and includes a foreword by Dan Harms. Now, Dr. Al shares all about the key aspects that set this grimoire apart from many others. He takes a look at the esoteric topography that Gilbert and Davies explore, and he also talks about the coercive techniques to work with spirits, the acquisition of magical books, and Dr. Al also answers your Glitch Bottle Patreon listener questions, and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Dr. Alexander Cummins. Dr. Alexander Cummins, thank you so much for coming back on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you for having me, Alex. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm especially excited to talk about this book and its practices and give some of its context to interested parties.
Can you tell us a little bit about Phil Legard and working with Phil and the genesis of this book with Scarlet Imprint? Like, how did this whole project come into being?
Absolutely, yeah. Phil is a dear friend as well as a colleague who shared with me some of the work he was doing with Additional Manuscript 36674 back when we were thinking about, or he was thinking about calling it Liber Assacelus, which we'll come to as to why he might have called it that. He'd become very interested in this book, and he knew that I was also a big grimoire hound, especially around 16th and 17th century English works, that this was written in the Vulgate, and also that it was a rather exceptional text that he wanted a bit of feedback around in terms of its structure and its supporting material. It is not only a grimoire of instructions. You know, we often talk about a grimoire as a complete system, right? It is indeed a complete system. Arguably, it's a complete system for, in fact, receiving other complete systems. It's not just channeled, it's a means of channeling. But it also contains what get called the Book of Visions, which are appended to it, which is a detailed scrying record. And as many magicians and historians of magic have pointed out, this is a little rare. It's not so uncommon for people to have books of magic, handbooks of magic, manuals, grimoires, these systems. But it's rather more rare for us to have the record of what people actually did with them, their magical diaries, their scrying record, their dream journals. And this is partly down to the fact that the legality of these kinds of practices has varied over the early modern period and was also somewhat nebulous in different regions as the law was differently applied. So in not wanting to indict oneself, it was less common for people to leave evidence of, I actually did this thing that may or may not be legal, and here's what demons turned up and told me. Right? It's not something that people tend to have written down as often, but it offers these fascinating glimpses and confirmations of the kind of behind the scenes of how a grimoire was itself channeled, if we want to put it like that, which I think is a fair way of putting it. There's a set of scrying exercises, as well as appeal to and conjuration of spirits to bring texts as well, and to receive these quote unquote, these sort of downloads, as we might put it now, if we were feeling particularly cyberpunky chaos magic about it. Receiving these signals and these texts and these instructions from a variety of sources. Phil is a dear pal from time that I was up in Leeds doing my undergrad and then my master's by research on astrological magic in the early modern period. Phil is a dear friend, and I hope won't be too embarrassed when I say, an excellent scholar and a very gifted magician. I recommend everyone check out his pamphlet, The Mirror of Elacona, through Hadean Press, which is both a really detailed study of a lesser-known grimoire operation, and also a great study and kind of magical autobiography, if you like, of working with the spirits of a particular Yorkshire river and working on, aspects of his own life in a way that is never navel-gazy, is never like overly reflective, but is reflexive in a useful way. Phil's done a variety of other works. If you've ever cast around looking for a quick and dirty PDF of the Grimorium Verum online, you're probably looking at Phil's edition that was probably pirated and leaked onto the net in some way. He's a dear friend and a very accomplished musician as well. His Hawthorne project with his good lady wife Layla is also well worth checking out for those interested in ritual music. And Phil has a deep and academic and practitioner engagement with musicology and its intersections with occult philosophy and magical practice. So it's been a delight to work with him over these last couple of years on this project. We're happy to sing Phil's praises to the rafters.
Can you kind of set for us, Dr. Al, the historical place that these two gentlemen came together and these experiments started taking place in 1567? What was going on? I mean, so many people know, of course, about Dee and Kelly and specific strains of English magic. Can you set us the kind of historic context as to what was going on at the time?
Yes, we've got a variety of endeavors going on. As a trained historian, I'm also very wary of resorting to kings and dates too early as being exactly the kind of thing that put a lot of people off history. Like maths, I think if you've had a bad experience, it can often kind of close off some otherwise fascinating and very edifying study. Those are also useful things to be looking at. So the major parts of the mid-16th century are, of course, the Protestant Reformation that's going on around this sort of time. We have Queen Elizabeth I coming to the throne in varieties of scandal as Mary Queen of Scots also accedes to the Scottish throne and then attempts the English throne, and Edward VI popping around here. It's a turbulent time, it's fair to say. We think about the early modern period in the British Isles as being most turbulent during the civil wars, plural, in the mid-17th century, the mid to late 17th century. But the 16th century has its share of, closings of monasteries, of Henry VIII being Henry VIII. There are a number of religious and political turmoils. The early modern term would be mutations, and this is the term for political upheaval. The term revolution itself starts to be used towards the end of the 16th century and the start of the 17th century, and arguably has a slightly astrological root to it. Not only is there a revolving of the wheel of fate as one, ruler is surpassed or supplanted or usurped by another, but there is literally a notion of rotating a chart of some kind, a horary chart. Without getting too far into what's going to happen later, by the 17th century, certainly astrologers are intimately connected to the Civil War and to being employed by both royalists and parliamentarians to tell their troops that the stars say God is on our side. There's a notion here of employing a thief to catch a thief, so to speak, employing an astrological propagandist to refute other astrological propagandists. But the 16th century gives us a variety of approaches to not only internal conflicts, varying ideas vying for dominance in the period. It also gives us the expansion of the thing that will later be coined famously by Dr. John Dee as the British Empire. It is a birth, or certainly a calcification, we might say, of British Empire, of imperial expansion and of colonialism into the quote-unquote, and here I am doing, it's not great for podcasts, but heavy scare quotes, into the quote-unquote new world, a world that was not so new to the people already living living there, of course. And this is relevant to us because Gilbert and Davies both are what we politely say as soldiers and explorers rather than, instruments of colonial domination, if I'm going to get on my soapbox about that kind of thing. And not only in the New World, thinking of Raleigh and Bacon and so on, but also into, closer afield, the British Isles, into military operations in Ireland and elsewhere. So it's a period of change, of different royal bids for legitimacy is a fair claim. Vast disagreeing points, one might say, between these Tudors. And it's a period where the stirrings of things that will later be called the scientific revolution are occurring as well. And some of the few pieces of research and excellent scholarship on the Excellent Booke and the manuscript collection that it is contained in, additional 36674, testify to this kind of intellectual revolution that's kind of occurring as well as we continue to shift from an older medieval view. And this is painting in very broad brushstrokes, how we move from a medieval idea of the Almighty has placed things in their place and it is not for us to question them, to a Renaissance humanism that says God has given us fingers and minds and tongues to poke and taste and articulate the world and to read the book of nature. And this exploration has a direct impact in epistemology, in the philosophy of knowledge, as regards, amongst other things, the conjuration of spirits to find out things you didn't know before. And as I say, Frank Larson has a fantastic essay on this in one of Claire Fanger's collections that's well worth looking at.
Can you give us a sense of who was Humphrey Gilbert and who was one of his neighbors and close companions, John Davies? And to that point, I know on page 8 there's a description of the age 28 Gilbert, saying that Gilbert was tall, well-built, with a strong but refined face, a somewhat sad face, weak, dark eyes, dark hair, a soft, short beard inclined to be curly, and a choleric complexion. Can you elaborate on kind of the mentality, for lack of a better phrase, or kind of the consciousness of Humphrey Gilbert and just how Humphrey Gilbert and John Davies met and started things?
Sure. At the time that they're doing these operations, again, as you say, spring 1567, Gilbert's 28 and serving as a captain to Henry Sidney, who's the Lord Deputy of Ireland at the time. He'd held a variety of military and government positions. He develops this reputation very quickly of being renownedly bloodthirsty. When we talk about someone having a choleric disposition, for a start, it's easy for us to think of colic of babies, of crying a lot. But of course, what we're talking about is humoral theory. We're most used to thinking about humoral theory, I think, in the modern age as a bygone bad medicine, right? Oh, yes, we used to think that you had to balance the elements in your body and that this maybe produces some weird medical things like a reliance on leeches and other forms of phlebotomy that we look down on now and see as very silly. Or we might even extend that to being, oh, yes, it's a 4-part personality typology, that the 4 humours of the body which correlate to the 4 classical elements of fire, air, water, and earth correspond to the choleric humour, or yellow bile, as it's sometimes called, or just bile, sometimes the bilious humour. Water to the phlegmatic humour, to the phlegm of the body. Blood to the sanguine humour, and air, carrying air in the body, obviously. And black bile, or melancholy, which is the Greek for black bile, to this earthy humour. We may know that, oh, yes, proper balance is important and underlies good health. It also underlies a variety of other concepts around truth and the proper maintenance and function of things, and not just people, but places can have humoral compositions. Foods certainly have humoral compositions, and so diet plays an important part in regulating those humours. And these obviously did underlie medicine, but also early psychology and psychiatry as well. A choleric person runs hot. They have a natural abundance, or overabundance, one might say, in excess of the yellow bile. What does that mean? Well, it's hot and dry, so they run very hot. And a lot of our figurative language survives from this deep significance and foundation in humoral theory. The idea of being hot-headed, the idea of boiling blood, of seeing red. All these things have a root in understanding how the elements relate to not just the microcosm of man and the macrocosm of the universe, we're made of the same building blocks, but also that this is how we move through the world and how it regulates, both upregulates and downregulates our experience and expression of our passions, of other people, of places, and especially of spirits. And so what's interesting about the reports of Gilbert apparently being a particularly vituperative, angry man, even for a soldier, even renownedly swearing the air a blue streak, even by sailors' standards, has an interesting impact that Phil and I found in looking through some of the conjurations that are found in this text. On the one hand, they're very kind of boilerplate, one might say. There's a standard to them. They're things that you can rattle off without thinking too hard about them, one might say, that you could rattle off while being furious, while, screaming at a spirit to be bound and to do your will. And on the other hand, there's a great deal of evidence that he was very into swearing at spirits in both the sense of using curse words, which is interesting there already that we use that terminology, but also literally imprecations of, if you do not do my will, God curse you, Jesus curse you, St. Luke curse you, St. John curse you, etc. Like litanies of these threats of various sorts. So much so that within the visions, the scrying record, we actually have record of the shade or the spirit or a Holy Ghost of St. Luke actually turning up and telling Gilbert to stop swearing so much when he's doing his magic, which I'm happy to get into the technicalities of that, but we have a record of just how personality seems to play into the style and the content of, and the delivery, crucially, the prosody, we might say, of conjuration, of what it means to swear together.
Can you tell us, Dr. Al, what should the listeners know about John Davies? Can you tell us anything about either his disposition or working with Gilbert? Is there anything that you'd like the listeners to know?
While they are doing these conjurations around this time, they're also seeking to petition for funding to explore what's called the Northwest Passage. There is a section of the Northwest Passage. They eventually do go and explore this, and there's a section of it called the Davis Strait, which is named after John Davis. He's credited as the inventor of a particular piece of navigation equipment, and is running in the same circles as John Dee, who, as many of your listeners will be aware, was also instrumental in developing more advanced navigation technologies for the nascent British Empire, right? Their ability to move sideways across the chessboard, if you want to, of latitude and longitude, if you want to put it like that, to come in on an angle kind of thing. And we know a little less about his temperament, but we do know that he was thoroughly recommended by the tutelary shades that turn up in the course of the scrying record, and whose advice is directly put down as the notine instructions of the grimoires, that he should frequently wear black. And this, I have a lot of both historical theory and also practical experience that doing this, as practical magicians don't need to be told that wearing certain clothes rather than certain other clothes gives different results. This is in many grimoires, usually around wearing priestly robes of some kind, or at the very least clean robes. There are some very specific instructions about the kind of black clothes that Gilbert's scryer should have to wear. He's slightly younger. He's in that he is the one seeing these things mostly. There are some dreams that seem to be experienced by Gilbert, and there are some things that Davis sees. There are some things that they both see. Again, people that have worked in tandem with a fellow, as the grimoires frequently put it, with a partner in crime of conjuration will be aware if there are points at which you both definitely witness the same thing happening and hear the same voice and see the same thing, and there are times when one of you will hear a bit more of it than the other. And this is attested in these scrying records in not a dissimilar way to Dee and Kelly's operations some 20 years later. And Davis, by the way, is when I say moving in the same circles as Dee, we know that certainly Dee and Gilbert were attending the same events and talking to each other. It is pretty much a matter of historical record that at least Dee strongly disliked Humphrey Gilbert. And again, I wonder about this very choleric personality meeting the more quiet and scholarly Dee, him finding him, a little bloviating and a little, arrogant and too sure of himself. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was remarking on this project when I was in Philadelphia at the Rare Books Department of the Free Library of Philadelphia, which I strongly recommend you go and check out. They have some fantastic things, including Charles Dickens' Raven that inspires the Raven of Poe, I believe. But they also have a first edition of A True and Faithful Relation of What Occurred Between John Dee and Some Spirits, the Merrick Casaubon character assassination of Dee, that is many people's first exposure to the angelical systems that will later be called Enochian, that Dee and Kelly are working on. And I was remarking on, I've been working on a text by some of Dee's contemporaries to one of the librarians, Humphrey Gilbert, and she turns her head and points to a map on the wall and says, "Oh, that Humphrey Gilbert?" And it's a map drawn by John Dee, signed to Humphrey Gilbert in the corner. We have this material history of this stuff between them. And again, it's about navigation. That's mostly what we know about Davies is his contributions to navigation. It's interesting how often the spirit work journals and scrying records and so on attest about what the spirits tell these operators that they can and can't say to other people. So again, ritual secrecy isn't just about the practicalities of not getting strung up as a witch or a diabolist. There's also the call is, coming from inside the house of Solomon to an extent, that some spirits are saying for this to work, you need to keep quiet about these things. Or, in the case of Dee frequently, you absolutely need to tell this king that we're not happy with him. Which is, again, a bold move.
Clearly serendipitous or not, that's amazing. The librarian turning around saying, "Oh, you mean that Humphrey Gilbert?" That's amazing.
Yes. That's part of the course when you're not just a historian of this or a practitioner who is drawing abstract inspiration, but are operating as somewhat more necromantically and more directly with the shades of these magicians. So this becomes the synchronicities pile up. They become rather more the kind of ping that you're on the right track than something that puts you off it.
Can you just kind of give the listeners a sense of the broad range of entities that are contacted here? Because we don't have just spirits, and I say just, obviously, but we don't have spirits like the four kings. There's also Job, there's King Solomon, there's Roger Bacon, there's Agrippa, there's, as you've touched on with St. Luke, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Can you give us a sense of kind of the broad range of entities that were contacted?
Sure, yeah. Well, the whole operation, as far as we can tell, the whole set of operations, the whole kit and caboodle, as it were, of the Excellent Booke and its visions begins, it seems, with a dream in which King Solomon visits probably Gilbert, but maybe Davies as well, and delivers a prayer that they should say regularly. And if they use this prayer along with a goodly stone, that more will be revealed. So there isn't a whole setup that looks like them going through a bunch of books and putting together a system or getting the system fresh out of the box. There's an opening prayer, and they do this opening prayer, and then other spirits start to show up. And initially, most of these spirits are the spirits of dead magicians and scriptural characters. I'd use character in a loose term. Dramatis personae, right? As you say, these range from a bunch of categorically people who were alive and renowned occult philosophers, and then usually in death, infamous negromancers, black magicians, not only Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, but also, as you say, Roger Bacon. Then some slightly more mythic figures like Solomon. Then some figures who aren't exactly magicians like Job, but still a scriptural figure. And Job has a significant impact in texts on piety and on a variety of Protestant thinkers, which is not surprising given the sometimes stereotypical, sometimes accurate take on the dourness of many Puritan ideas about predestination and so forth. But then, yes, we go right back to Adam, the first father and first magician, right? They give more instructions on what they should be doing, crucially, what they should be wearing and how they should be conducting themselves. There is a sense less of, in this ritual, here is our version of the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, and then you do this thing, and then you do this thing, and more a sense of, so you're trying to become more powerful magicians. Okay, great. Well, you need to remember to forswear bad company. Definitely you need to swear less. You need to be good to the poor. You need to conduct yourself in a moral manner inside and outside of your spirit rooms and temple spaces. And I think that's a really interesting difference. This isn't said as for 7 days or for 3 days before the operation or for 40 days before the operation, purify yourself. This is live well and live cleanly and go in clean apparel. And again, be good to the poor, give alms to those who ask for it. There is I don't want to say a moral injunction, but there's a sense that when are you not a magician? If you're attempting to do this stuff, it should not just be the hobby that you pick up when you go into your oratory or your well-prepared, room or temple space, right? That this is something that's happening to you throughout your life.
To that point, Dr. Allen, one of your supplementary essays, which are just wonderful, the essay Sorcerous Significances on page 181, you touch on that. You touch on ethics, for example, and you mentioned that, quote, necromancy appears to have acknowledged shifting religious and ethical sensibilities and democratized along with other forms of magic. Whatever the reasons, it is clear neither Catholicism nor the celibate had exclusive rights to the dead. And you mentioned there's this kind of easing of course, you need to be a good person, you need to, make sure to have the utmost respect, etc. But in terms of sexual taboos, can you kind of touch on that and just kind of in general on this kind of stripped down Protestant ritual in the larger context?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I definitely follow in the footsteps and the footnotes of Frank Claassen, pointing out that across a variety of these texts of Protestant magicians adapting the rituals of the quote-unquote old religion of the grimoires that are being utilized by Catholic magicians, that they are either through the express instruction of spirits or from their own consciences no longer operating in a Catholic way. We have a couple of manuscripts of, say, the Heptameron, which I know is a text dear to your heart, that have the instructions to have, say, the Pentacle of Solomon, which should be consecrated under at least one, and I think usually 3 masses. That's entirely scratched out. It's copied out and then deliberately put a line through. And in one of those manuscripts, we even have a little marginalia, which just says popery or papery, right? It's this idea of we're not Catholic and we're not going to do Catholic magic, we're going to do Protestant magic. And these scrying records show that, it certainly seems spirits still turned up for that. I hesitate to say that that's just means that you can swap and change whatever parts of a grimoire you want. I don't think this is a pick and mix of I like this part and I don't like this part necessarily. But I think understanding why certain changes are made over time is really crucial in giving a context for them. And also, crucially, that there is a patronage of spirits, and gosh, what better patronage for a grimoire than spirits of magicians, helping you along the way and giving you guidance and letting you know what's what. This is especially relevant because, as you kind of touched upon, there are a variety of entities beyond these shades of magicians that turn up. There are the 4 demonic kings, for instance, as we touched on. I'm happy to talk more about those. The chief spirit that is appealed to, the kind of head of the spirit hierarchy, is Azazel, which is pretty clearly Azazel, and who is referred to as the ruler of the dead and the keeper of the dry bones. There are also spirits that we generally identify as angelic, so crucially Ankor and Anilor, who are spirits that may be called angels in other grimoires. There's a whole set of modular operations for scrying where you call in 3 good angels into the stone to kind of bless the stone and make sure that whatever other spirit comes in to show you visions or to tell you things remains truthful. We also find Ankor and Anilor in many of the conjurations of ritual names that are intoned at the putting on of garments. So again, the emphasis on proper ritual attire is stressed. So we have some spirits that are said to be angels in other texts that behave very much like aerial spirits. They change form, they change number sometimes, and they're asked why they're shifting so much, and then they pretty directly respond that they don't like being bound. They don't owe the conjurer anything, and unless the conjurer is either going to step up their offerings or step up their means of trapping the spirits, that they might chat a little bit to you, but they're not going to do a bunch of magical work for you for nothing. And then there are other spirits that are found in the visions. The visions start to take on this quality of moving through a landscape of some kind, and they take a variety of bizarre animal forms: headless birds, strange rabbit spirits, strange burrowing spirits, what sounds like a badger or a coney. Again, not all of them are even worked with. They're moving through this landscape and almost more like explorers and indeed colonialists, finding the resources that they want to exploit and demarking them and forcing them into doing what they want them to do.
Perhaps, Dr. Al, we could start with some of the ritual equipment as well. So the crystal stone, the shoe stone, can you tell us a little bit about this specific piece of equipment and why was this so central, especially, as you said, not only dealing with more angelic, celestial, super celestial beings, but also perhaps more sublunary, aerial spirits as well?
Yeah, absolutely. For a start, the easiest answer here is there's more than one stone. All right. There's a stone that is said you can use for whatever spirit you want to be using them for. And there's also, it's said you should have another stone which is only for calling definitely angelic spirits into. And this makes sense, right? Not mixing your colors in your palette too much, especially with more, shall we say, devilish spirits, some of the more spicier fellows. And this is a great piece of advice in general, really, I think. The stone is said to be flat and circular, so again, like the kind of scrying mirror kind of stuff. Again, you're meant to have at least one. There is a vague pattern that kind of looks like a cartoon of a cloud in many ways, and this itself is not unusual. There are many visions within the visions and also elsewhere in the wider corpus of early modern conjuration where we see this in Kelly, where a spirit appears out of a cloud, so that the first thing one sees in the stone is this kind of cloudy thing, and it coheres. And this is, very familiar and coterminous with the idea of having, of suffumigation and of burning, an awful lot of incense. And while I don't think we need to go as far as some of the more modern conjuration texts in the 1980s that talked about, spirits require smoke to be able to cohere, and the debate about what counts as physical manifestation or material manifestation, or however we want to phrase it. But certainly this idea that one doesn't expect to just see a fully formed spirit straight away, and some of them stick an arm out of this kind of cloud. They also see themselves in the stone as well. The cloud clears sometimes and reveals themselves in the spirit world doing magic and being told, this is how you command spirits, or this is how you call spirits, crucially through threatening them with swords, or indeed threatening them with grimoires, with books. So there are at least two stones. There's also what suggests to be stones on the walls as well. It's specifically said that you'll see at least one stone on a wall. But the interesting part of this is that it's very clear about what spirit contact starts to look like, which is a thing shadowy in the stone, which is in the wall. We have a notion that it's not necessarily flat on the table, you're looking at it. It also says that when we call the four kings, that we should turn to their quarters, which we should be very familiar with. The idea of the four kings is that they're pretty much always put at the cardinal directions. And while the particularities of whether Ourian's, his name withstanding, is almost always in the east, but there are versions, and Dr. Stephen Skinner has done tables on this, as has Jake Stratton Kent, on where these particular demon kings occur elsewhere in the four quarters. But the idea seems to be that there are also four stones on the walls of the oratory of the spirit room as well, and that you call those senior spirits into each of those stones or through those stones in some way until you see a thing shadowy in them. And this is the start of the operation. It's not the conclusion of it, but it's a significant part of it. So we're dealing with several stones, basically. That's one of the most significant parts of this, I think, that the stones are not only do you have a clean one and an all-purpose one, one that you keep special just for nice holy angels, and one that you use as a general purpose spirits one. Also, there's an issue here with flippantly gets called caller ID sometimes. How do you know if this spirit is a clean or unclean spirit sometimes? Especially the idea that unclean spirits might pretend to be angels. Having a general stone therefore means that you can judge the spirit on what it tells you, not on intrinsic ideas of what it should look like. But also this notion of having stones to use to call the four kings is an idea I've been exploring in my own practice for quite a while, and found it very, very fruitful. Beyond the stones, the other thing that I find interesting about the Excellent Booke's instructions for its ritual equipment is that it's kind of, I don't want to say it's vague, but it's not as specific as one might expect. You are meant to do suffumigation, but the suffumigation just says sweet powders and perfumes. It doesn't list specific incenses. It just says, what feels sweet to you. It does list that one should have very particular inks, which I find interesting. These colored inks must be had. That's literally the first thing in the grimoire. They appear to be pretty planetary. but one is also meant to have, in the same manner of, great plenty of sweet powders and perfumes, whatever you want to burn that's good to you. It also says that you should have a couple of good books to call by. So there's this assumption that you have access to, or the hope or the instruction is that you should get access to books of conjuration. And yeah, use those. That's fine. The Excellent Book also has particular conjurations you give that you should perform, like the one given by King Solomon in Dream that kicks the whole operation off. That's still utilized. It still asks that you be brought forth the proper spirits to give you the proper tuition and to grant you the power to do magic. But it doesn't say, you have to use, unless it specifies the conjuration in there, it also just says, having a book to call by is good. Right? So again, this kind of mixture of very specific things and also more general things, to me, speaks of this kind of, this wider notion in early modern conjuration, this kind of tradition of innovation is what I end up calling it a lot of the time. The idea that you do what is commonly regarded as magic. You get a stone and a prayer, and you say the stone to the prayer until some spirits turn up and maybe give you some advice about what to do next, right? But on the other hand, there are very set things that the spirits will deliver as well. Particular conjurations, particular salutes, particular signs that the spirit assents, along with advice from tutelary spirits of various sorts about how to ensure the spirit's obedience in the case of the Excellent Book. There's this very interesting admixture. The inks that are required, the different colored inks, are almost certainly directly derived from one of the visions that Davies has of Gilbert in the spirit realm, holding a book up and commanding the spirits through just showing them the book like it was a loaded gun or something. And the book is said to have been written in many colors of ink. I mean, this is also consistent within the Grimoire tradition. The Sefer Retzialis has an awful lot of ink stuff in it, in making these inks through astrological empowerments and utilizing their planetary and zodiacal virtues, that one is creating magical inks for magical books. But the book itself becomes, again, book as talisman, a classic topic that magicians, love to return to. But that isn't just historical precedent of the Retzialis, which is being circulated at this time, and it gets pretty popular with early modern magicians. It's also attested in their actual visions, right? And this is again that admixture of they're doing their research, but they're also doing practical experiments and learning from both. They're combining these two rich avenues and streams of magical knowledge to further their own magical knowledge. So again, I think of this whenever debates come up between modern magicians about, are you doing too much research or are you overly relying on practice? Well, most of our magical forebears were actually pretty good at doing both.
You even mentioned that the importance of books and their provenance extends not only to merely delivering a text, but for instance with Ourians, for example, you can actually say and charge Ourians to help you read and understand a text if one is presented and maybe the meaning isn't too clear. So not only are spirits being, sharing books or delivering information via some kind of Liber, but at the same time even explaining it. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I find this one of the most fascinating parts of it, that not only are the four kings appealed to for the authority to send forth other spirits, they're also themselves considered tutelary and can be conjured to deliver not only the text or the content of the text, but also its understanding. They give us very specific example where they say, in this kind of manner of devilish trickery, right, of this kind of quiet robot mutiny of he's demanded I bring him a text. All right, I'm going to bring him a text in a language he can't speak. How's he going to like them apples? And it says, they may bring you a text that you can't read, at which point you say this particular conjuration, which is basically, what the hell is this? Don't play me like that. Come back here and read it to me, or change it into a language I can understand. And you don't get to leave until I know what this says and how to use it.
This is a total false dichotomy, but I'm just going to set this up for the listeners too. Jake Stratton Kent and yourself and others have kind of talked about, there are these two traditions in a lot of the grimoires. There's this kind of coercive, I don't want to say Catholic, but just very coercive method of you shall do this or you shall be thrust into the eternal pit of fire until the day of judgment. And then there's this older Goetic tradition that takes a totally different approach that is not nearly as coercive. And yet here we have this stripped down Protestant ritual in an excellent book of the Arte of Magicke. What tributary does this belong to, quote unquote? Is it a false dichotomy? Does it belong to a specific tradition?
So on the one hand, although certain Protestant magicians are getting rid of some of the explicitly Catholic elements of these grimoire instructions, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're any more friendly to these spirits. The Excellent Booke is full of techniques of spirit torture, full of them. Not just the, I will, burn your seal if you don't do what I tell you to do, but a variety of other things you can do with the seal as well. It says if the spirit is of a fiery nature, you should put it in stinking water. The euphemism here is probably putting it in human urine, because it's a fiery spirit and it doesn't want to be in the water. That you torture them by their elemental opposites, right? That you dampen those spirits, that you cast earthy spirits to the winds is another example. Or you set fire to the seals of watery spirits. You're categorically doing things that they do not like until they do what you say. There's other examples of like the psychological games that you play with spirits. So the notai of the Excellent Booke suggests that when you first conjure a spirit, you should ensure that there's an exercise that you find in a variety of places, which is basically that you should hide an item of some kind, usually a ring, and then you should ask the spirit where the ring is, right? And if the spirit can find it, then you know that the spirit is at least qualified to find things, right? Gilbert and Davies, and I think it's probably mostly Gilbert, take this a step much further, which is to say, do that thing, and then even when, almost especially when the spirit does point to where the ring is, you should call the spirit a liar anyway and put it on the back foot in this kind of bad cop and worse cop interrogation of it. It's not pleasant. And we do find some instances of a slightly less antagonistic relationship in some 16th century grimoires of what get called particularly of the Baconian stream. I'm thinking here of like Dinigromantia which an edition of is also found in the manuscript collection called Additional Manuscript 36674, in which it is not uncommon to offer spirits either animals or wax effigies of animals, crucially. And the most famous example is the Agnus Dei, right, the wax seal of the Lamb of God, and that this is not just giving a sacred thing to spirits to command it, but also is kind of itself the sacrifice of a lamb or an effigy of a lamb to a spirit. So it's rather more, how do we want to put it? We're back to the two streams that Agrippa gives of the two kinds of conjuration that quote-unquote goetic magicians use, or geotic as it's sometimes spelled in the early modern, which I really like, which is that you can either command spirits by the names of God, these wicked spirits, these unclean spirits is the term that gets used a lot. And I like that distinction. Unclean, not necessarily explicitly evil, but definitely unclean. You can command them, and Agrippa says, this is bad because you're still consorting with unclean spirits, but it's not so bad. Or you can give them sacrifices, or you can worship them. And Agrippa says this is the worst of the worst things you can do, because this is idolatry. You're putting your soul in danger. You're putting these unclean, often deceitful spirits above you in authority, and you'll come a cropper. This is Agrippa is very clear that this is a very bad thing. Honestly, what we get with the Excellent Booke eventually is a kind of halfway house, or a third option between these two ideas of very antagonistic and very worshipful. And it's that eventually St. Luke steps forward exactly when he's saying you're swearing too much and you're kind of taking the Lord's name in vain a little bit here. You're kind of going off on one a little bit too much. How about this? You just call me and I'll get the spirits to do what they're meant to do. It is a very interesting halfway house. It isn't quite either of those models. It's closer to commanding them with holy names, but you're literally calling in the spirit of an evangelist to do that stuff for you. And it looks rather more like, if we're going to find a stream for it, looks rather more like some of Jake's uncovering and ceremonial pointing at the role of the Archangel Michael as vice-regent not only of heaven but of a variety of unclean spirits as well. That you kick that up the hierarchy, so to speak, so that you don't have to deal with that either by bribing them or threatening them, that's done by another figure that has a natural spiritual authority over them. There's a very interesting set of things that are going on there. I mean, that's also coupled with the fact that obviously it's full of imprecations to God the Almighty and to Jesus Christ and to a certain extent to Mary as well as the implicit authority that King Solomon says, like, you guys can command spirits now. I am telling you and them that I'm giving you, I'm passing my mantle on to you kind of thing, or I'm extending my mantle to you, which is fascinating in terms of why one would appeal to a lineage of magicians as well, especially in a quote-unquote Solomonic tradition, right? So there's that, but then on the other hand, you're also appealing at the start of your operation to Azazel, to one of the Enochic fallen angels who is said to be responsible for most, if not all, sin in the world. Right, so again, there's this kind of serving with both hands that's going on here that looks in part like a variety of works, but also looks like this fascinating and vital synthesis of them.
Broadly speaking, Dr. Al, from these visions that took place between February 24th and April 6th, what would you like the listeners to know in terms of the broad strokes?
One of the very early visions is seeing themselves. It's seeing themselves doing magic. And it's not clear where they're said to be, but it's also said that there are like these spirits like men, not men, but like men, that Gilbert is suppressing in various manners. The vision mentions the colors that are used in the work that appear on the first folio. The visions open up with Gilbert dressed in black with a sword and Davies carrying a book that's bound in skin. It's said to be the hairy side outwards. And this notion of what the different things that books are bound in is very interesting. There's a notion of the book with its skin still on it, with its hair still on it. There's notions later of crystal books as well, or books bound in crystal. And so they see themselves doing magic and then do that magic that they see themselves doing, and it works, and more spirits turn up to help them to do further magic. The other major vision that they have is of what is later referred to as the House of Solomon itself, which is a great wood, a forest that they go through, and then find themselves at this house which has 9 keyholes, and inside they place a variety of these sigils at the keyholes. They're allowed to enter this chamber, and inside is this tree of crystal, and the tree has a door which they then go through and find another tree of blood, and has these books growing from the tree. And the idea is that they start doing this quite regularly, to the point where the scrying record doesn't really give all of the detail. It just says, like, I sent my boy to the House of Solomon and he went and got another text. Right, he picked another tree off the book, it seems, in this vision, and then reads it. And these often have crystal covers. There's visions of dragons. There's visions of this golden hill, which is like square and has the tree of blood on it. It has the 4 evangelists barefoot and looking very angelic as well. The visions start to take on, for want of a better term, a more kind of psychedelic approach. They start to see things like, blazing golden clouds on this hill, these strange dogs with huge feet, which again promise to teach them how to make or consecrate or receive magic books, books of power. They start to see these strange flying spirits. They start to witness these angels, the Anchor and Anulkor. They see, a variety of kinds of bird spirits, and they start having more discussions with spirits that they aren't necessarily, or it doesn't list that they are explicitly conjuring and binding and calling, that they're kind of encountering, or that are even kind of seeking them out, or that they're just finding by kind of wandering around in the spirit plane, so to speak. That sounds a little, ambly and vague, but it's what they record. It starts to become more shorthanded as they do this thing more and more, right? You end up writing like, did the usual, right? Many of us who keep magical journals will be familiar with this kind of stuff. Also, in talking to these spirits at various points, they start to reveal to Gilbert and Davies that they themselves will become prophetic. It's said that Gilbert will become as to a saint, this kind of role as like sacred vessels for this knowledge. The visions have a mixture of like, this spirit turned up and said this thing, and also, we wandered through this strange landscape, and, the sky went purple, and there was a vision within the vision of these clouds doing these strange V-shaped things, and everything went golden. They start to sound quite alchemical, basically, in attempting to find a better word for it, kind of psychedelic. They take on a much stranger quality than just, I see the spirit inside the triangle. They're expansive, they're exploratory, and crucially, they're in the realm of spirit in some fashion, right? They're not just seeing themselves in their own oratory.
Not only are the scryer and the operator gaining knowledge and talking with spirits, but they're actually moving through a kind of esoteric landscape. Is this kind of topography reflected anywhere else in your research, or is this pretty unique in terms of how pronounced it is in this book, in the Excellent Booke?
It's relatively particular to this kind of working so far. I'm very open to finding more examples of it. I don't want to say that it's only found here, but it's the clearest example of it here. As I said, the accounts we have of what people actually experienced in doing these works are a bit thin on the ground. They seem to have an admixture of, we don't even have the clear sense of, some of these might be recorded dreams as often as they are, sat literally seeing it or it being beamed into the head, around a crystal in an oratory, right? They're very particular. They certainly feel more dreamlike in terms of their description, but they, as in many dream incubation rituals, or rituals that we're pretty sure are dream incubation rituals, there isn't a point usually of like, then you will fall asleep and have a dream where this thing happens. No, it just skirts immediately to. And the 3 chairs that you have put by your bed, the spirits will enter and will sit on the chairs, and you will talk to them. And if you play your cards right, they'll give you a ring of invisibility. There's often not this, you take the skull from the graveyard and ask for the lottery numbers, and you put it under the bed, and in the night the spirit will come for its head back, for its skull back, and that's when you extort the lottery numbers from it. That's an operation, a Cyprianic operation in the Swedish Black Books collection. It's particularly practical, right? But again, there's no point of like, often there's not a recorded switch of modalities of consciousness. Like, you're always like experiencing the world, and while we might distinguish between true dreams and just the processing of the day, the gate of horn and the gate of ivory, as the Greeks had it, it doesn't make it less real. There's almost like a deliberate lack of categorized distinction between scrying and dream at this point. And I think that's the angle that I've been exploring more thoroughly since, and finding the most fruitful comparisons.
To your point, can you talk about how the visions that are recorded in the Excellent Book bled into the waking world, as it mentions in the book, in the form of encounters with demonic dogs and even the physical manifestation of the prophet Job? Can you share with the listeners a little bit more about this?
Yeah, they're called brended, the demonic dogs, very often. They take on a strange kind of chimeric quality, which isn't quite fully, he appeareth with the head of a lion and the body of an eagle, and the kind of thing that we might be familiar with is sort of like quote-unquote classic goetic appearances or chimeras. But they are uncanny and and often like monstrous, but they're different in some way. There's like a kind of flying spirit that is just these conjoined black wings with no other body. It's just the wings flapping, or a variety of these kind of burrowing spirits that are strange. The dogs with massive feet and hooves, not to mention, actual dragons and things like that. I think this speaks to an interesting distinction between 15th and 16th century spirit encounters and later 17th century ones. As we progress through the early modern period, spirits seem to get stranger, and they seem to appear more chimeric and more kind of cut up, right? Whereas, we look at some of the earlier encounters of spirits in the Book of Offices, and they can appear as just like a goose. Like, they look like a swan or a hedgehog or bears. And this kind of chimerification, I think, a wider epistemological shift that's occurring, where sight and vision themselves are considered increasingly not to be always relied on, that like we're looking more into optical illusions. Sight moves away from this thing of like, I saw it and therefore I know it to be true, and an empowerment of the devil, that the devil may be able to fool your sight and thus make you think things that aren't necessarily the case. Somewhere in there, older British fairy and familiar lore of things like a black cat or a black dog or like a weird goose start to turn into these rather more explicitly strange and demonic concatenations of various animals. So I think there's something heraldic about that. And again, I don't want to say it's alchemical in the sense of like these are all innuendo or instructions or metaphor for practical lab alchemy, but there's something about the insignia and the emblematic value of these appearances that is telling us something about the nature of the interaction as much as the nature of the spirit itself.
when it comes to specific things like, for instance, as you mentioned, some spirits saying, when asked why do they change so much, it's like we don't like to be bound. We don't like that. I'm thinking of the Sworn Book of Honorius, for example, where it specifically uses terms, not demon specifically, but daemon, and how there are aerial spirits, that yes, there are these super celestial angels that you cannot bind, etc. It's not just this kind of false dichotomy of angels and demons. There is this fluidity. Can you share with the listeners a little bit more about that fluidity in the Excellent Book, and then how it relates to other examples of magic as well?
Sure. I think the Excellent Book is a great example here, where it's operating in I guess the word traditional could mean a bunch of things in this context, but I think it shows that there is a continuity of practice of less having, Michael Sellis's neat typology and doing a checklist of like, what heaven is this particular spirit from, and where does it fit in my grand and very strict hierarchy. The more we look to nature, the more it confounds our categorization of it. And I think this is true in early modern conjuration, honestly, as well. Not only do we have the shifts that we can trace through the manuscript history of grimoires themselves, through the material and textual and intellectual history of when an aerial spirit starts being referred to in a new translation as an angel. We get that again with the Heptameron in its earlier incarnations. But where angels are as angels do, to a certain extent, and that we have to base our work with them on what they tell us and what they do and how regularly they do it. And hopefully what's confirmed through divination, whether that be, dream or something more computational.
In your supplementary essays as well, you have just a wonderful one that really talks about King Solomon, this exorcist king. He is an incredibly important figure, obviously, in the grimoire tradition. And yet, can you talk about, in an excellent book of the Art of Magicke, King Solomon is also given, I guess you could say, or kind of assigned as an assistant in kind of these operations with Humphrey Gilbert and John Davies. Can you kind of expand on that and share with the listeners about, like, you have King Solomon, this amazing exorcist king, and then Solomon's role in an excellent book of the Art of Magicke?
Yeah. He turns up and says, these spirits will serve you, and he kind of puts himself in that same category when he's talking about these tutelary shades of the dead magicians. But then they're also fairly early on assured at one of the visions of the kind of square golden hill with the four evangelists who appear as angels that explicitly tell Gilbert that thou hast a servant, and they're indicating to King Solomon, that will make thee a saint. Right? So again, this like the tutelary spirits aren't just presenting information or even, teaching the understanding of it as various other spirits are. That understanding is itself transformative and will make you more holy, more sacred, more powerful, crucially. And so this model of appeal to tutelary spirits, in this case, starts to take on more of a quality of who is helping who and for what purpose, And certainly it seems to play into Gilbert's choleric boldness, shall we say, of wanting to be in charge. They certainly seem to be framing things in a way that he's going to find agreeable.
You mentioned on page 267, quote, a possible distinction is made between the exact roles of Solomon and Cyprian in another set of appeals, quote, by Saint Cyprian, who subjugated you with his command, and also by the most wise Solomon, whose orders forced you to obey, unquote. And you say it should be noted, however, that this potential distinction is complicated by instructions to spirits, quote, to fulfill my desires truly as you obediently subjugated yourself to the true and wise and most skilled Solomon, unquote. So can you talk about that kind of complex relationship, and also, and you write about this so eloquently, but also how that relates to the kind of legatio, or the constraint, or the binding? What do you want the listeners to know about that?
Yeah, gosh. So it is worth us thinking about nuance in language always when we're conjuring, right? It is worth us thinking about the stages of an operation, absolutely. It is worth us thinking about what are we doing at these different steps, what is necessary here. It's easy to frame magic as this monolith of tradition, of like, well, you do that because that's the thing you do. And there's certainly examples here of like, do this thing. Why? You'll know once you've done it. So there is a little bit of that kind of like, you don't have to know how every part of your computer works to use a computer necessarily, but if you really want to get good at computers, you're going to try and take it apart, and you're going to hopefully call in a pal who can help you work out what different parts of the computer do to make it do what you want it to do more effectively. I hope that's not too extended a metaphor there. There's points at which you are appealing to what does it mean to appeal to the authority of a spirit or a tutelary spirit? One who has been, Solomon, for instance, is said to have been made wise by God, right? And again, we get this idea played out again and again that they have received divinely inspired knowledge and understanding of the world. We get exactly the same with Adam, right? Who's certainly by the early modern period, there's a lot of apocryphal texts about what Adam and Eve get up to, which some of them have a quality of like the further adventures of the first man and first woman, like outside of the garden, like all the things they get up to, which are usually about falling down crying about how awful the world is outside of Eden. But there are also these kind of superpowers that are attributed to these early people, or these people who have received direct empowerment from their piety, and also that includes their magic. So appealing to the way in which the old pacts may still be in place, right? It's one of the ways I've been thinking it, that one isn't necessarily dressing up as Solomon and saying, even when one says I am Solomon, right? And this is a performative act. I maintain that we're not fooling the spirits when we do that. We're not disguising ourselves. Partly because I think any spirit that's going to be fooled by a paper crown is probably not the best spirit to be working with. That's somewhat of a gullible spirit. That said, we are part of the historiola of that endeavor, right? We are not saying we are categorically the same, but there is an ontological category that says we are doing the same ritual, we're in the same story that exists outside of linear time, and we are engaging in that ritual appeal, not just as a precedent, not just as saying you did it for Solomon, now do it for me, not even, although I think this is very powerful, as the pacts and as the protocols that were set up by Cyprian or Solomon or Alexander were put forth, and I now obey those rules, so you have to obey them too. You're also, stepping in the same wake of ritual action. You're engaging in the spirit of the practice itself with spirits. You talk of historiola is useful here. There's a fabulous essay that I've just finished editing for an upcoming necromancy anthology from Cadmus, who's an excellent philosopher and magician who writes for Gods and Radicals frequently, about exactly this, about the act of necromancy from a classical Greek take or an ancient Greek take, is one in which you are engaging in the same story, that you and spirits are all making meaning through not just ritual storytelling like around a campfire, but that this is actually the basis of like magic and consciousness, right? That there's a far deeper level going on here. It's really inspired me and got me thinking about these things again from that kind of angle. So I'm excited for that to come out later this year.
There's that understanding that connects to a larger tradition, and if the magician, and I love your computer analogy about, you don't have to know everything about your computer to use a computer, but if the operator is fulfilling their end of the terms or the bargain, quote unquote, that gives license to the spirit to fulfill their end, as opposed to, say, just flat out fooling them or dressing up or things like that.
Yeah. The example that Cadmus gives is it actually concerns the lion skin belt, and that this is less simply about an appeal to an Empyrean realm where the lion skin contains solar virtue and may bestow choleric courage, but that it is a reference to the catabasis of Hercules. And again, he says, you're not fooling these spirits and saying, I'm Hercules because I'm wearing a lion skin, but you are engaging in that same story again.
To that point, Dr. Al, too, can we talk a little bit about when it comes to the goals that are delineated in an excellent book of the Art of Magicke? The main goal was the acquisition of knowledge. Can you talk about why was this perhaps the main goal, especially when you consider Gilbert and Davies, and how does that contrast to, say, perhaps one thinks of the Lemegetans Goetia, but there's an entire register of spirits that have knowledge, of course, herbs and astrology and things like that, but this is a specific focus on knowledge.
I mean, as I quipped before, it seems Gilbert and probably Davies are not men overburdened with an abundance of humility. Their main endeavor is to get whether that's Ourians or other spirits, to deliver the best book that ever was, is the phrase that's used, I think, a couple times. So they're explicitly trying to do ritual experimentation in order to receive the knowledge of how to do more magic, doing magic, to receive instruction on how to do better magic, to do better magic, to do better magic. It's very bootstrappy. And as Frank Clarson has pointed out, this has this deep context in shifting epistemologies, not just about the troubling of sight or about like the role of the devil increasing after the Protestant Reformation, him moving, as Theo Brown says in The Fate of the Dead, from this kind of crossroads trickster who can be bested to a rather more horned and hoofed great man in black who becomes a lot more sinister and ubiquitous and powerful and can fool us more than we can fool him. We have this quality here of moving from the sense of medieval, don't touch the cosmos, don't poke it, you'll make God angry, to an early modern, no, God wants us to understand things and wants us to elevate our consciousness, right, in various ways. One of these is this sense of find things out. How do we find things out? By carrying out experiments. As many historians of magic and the good historians of science have pointed out, the experimental method, inductive logic, a lot of these methodologies that are, benchmarks of the scientific revolution come about from magicians who have this practice of like, well, I don't know exactly what this spirit's going to look like or what it's going to tell me, but I know how to summon it. And when I do that, it turns up and it tells me things, and then I test those things. There's an emergent experimentalism. The very word experiment is frequently used for these kinds of operations. In the French, I'm told that's, experiment and experience are very linked there as well. So there's a phenomenological component as well as an epistemological one. And crucially, Clarson has this wonderful phrase about how the efforts of Gilbert and Davies then are like, have one foot in this emergent scientific methodology and one foot in the past in what he calls the old dirty medieval magic, which I very much like. I love that liminality of them. I love that bridging of things. I love that combination. I love that sense of calling spirits to not just to put in a good word with the Almighty for me or generally bless me, but like help me understand what's going on so that I can act in a more astute, shrewd, and cunning manner.
Can you share, Dr. Al, also a little bit about or flesh out more the relationship of the Excellent Book of the Art of Magicke and the treatment of the four demonic kings, Ourian, Zabemon, Paimon, and Aegon? Many listeners are familiar with the Lemegetans Goetia. Depending on the grimoire, the kings cannot even be approached or conjured or evoked. They are simply there as kind of gate openers or kind of controlling the faucet of esoteric tributaries that other spirits can kind of cruise in on. But here we have, obviously, as you mentioned, a direct engagement. What is the treatment of the four kings in the Excellent Book?
It's interesting, right? On the one hand, they are directly appealed. So they said that after you've called Asarso, I say this chief fallen angel by the Enochic mythology or corpus, you will then also call a kind of intermediary spirit, but then after that you will call Ourians, who is described as a ruler over the wicked. But when he has come, you're said to command him straightly to appear to your sight. And it's, again, this idea that the Excellent Book specifies the reason that when we can see a spirit in some way, we know it's there in some way. We can't just have a sense of it vaguely, because the presence might be there, and this is an experience I think many of us share in some of our early conjurations, that there's definitely a sense that there's something else in the room right now, or that there's something looking back at you, but it may be flitting about. And this is certainly their experience as well. They take very close attention to the direction that spirits come in, which I think is a reference back to the offices of the spirits, where the four senior demonic rulers, regents or kings of the parts of the earth or of the winds sometimes are used as a kind of, not just an organizational principle, but like that, in theory, Ourians rules all spirits coming from the east. So it's a way of knowing who's in charge and who you can appeal to, and where you can, to use a rather facile sort of comparison, how you are able to tell whatever spirit it is that you want to speak to its manager. This is a way of appealing to an authority over them by sheerly where they have turned up in relation to you. So on the one hand, it seems that the four kings are appealed to in a way that is consistent with ways that they are treated in other grimoires, where they are called to or even called in, but not conjured or bound. They are huge, proud spirits that far more often send forth their emissaries, their sub-kings, or their messenger spirits. But it is also said that one should command the spirit that will answer to Ourians to appear to your sight, or they'll there's all sorts of interesting phenomena that are listed as well in the Excellent Booke's noto, that Ourians can make your stone actually move. It'll leap about, and there are various injunctions and imprecations. But then you command it to give you, quote, the best book that ever was, right? It says, seeing thou, as thou art the king of the spirits of the east, I charge thee to do it. And when he's brought you the book in the stone to your sight, then charge him to deliver it to you, or appoint him some place where he shall lay it, and let it be done with speed. Again, there's this sense of like, now, there's this constant sense of like, don't tarry, which we find in many grimoires. And I think that's not just about banging the table with your knife and fork and saying, I want it now, and having a tantrum. I think it's also to keep the focus. A lot of the time in spirit conjuration, what weakens our operations is losing focus, is not sticking to the conversation we're having, which I think is another reason why speaking out loud rather than speaking quote-unquote telepathically to spirits is far more useful, that you're charging the actual air with those sacred words and with your intent. I think it's also where minding our language becomes a lot more useful, and allowing to speak in the green tongue, right? Being able to speak with the ambiguity that works for us rather than against us. Not being lost in the spirit but not the letter of the command, but of allowing that to open up and to make interaction and conjuration, again, swearing with spirits, a thing that widens our modalities of agency rather than confining them.
To that point, Dr. Al, it's mentioned on page 20, quote, the Excellent Book contains many elements of interest to those who are attempting to reconstruct historical attitudes to and practices of ritual magic. For example, we have Gilbert's belief that the spirits may be present when called, yet invisible. However, it is apparent that Gilbert believes that they will only obey the master if they are called to visible appearance in the stone, and that Gilbert also bullies the spirits in a manner that seems perfectly apt to a man with military training. So can you talk about that, Dr. Al, to that point, in terms of they may be invisible, but they can still be present, but they will only obey you, according to Gilbert, if they are called to visible appearance. Can you talk about these kind of two seemingly opposite observations?
Yeah, and this is something that frequently baffles historians of magic who aren't themselves practitioners. I was at a conference that I will not name earlier in the year, which was a mixture of academics, and there were some practitioners there as well. And this point around invisibility came up, of the invisible doesn't mean imperceptible, right? That there are ways of sensing spirits in a variety of manners, and that the shift in a room, the sense of being stared back at, are real things, and sometimes that's all that's required, is this like heavy presence rather than a specific visible thing, for want of a more precise language there. But the idea that certain phenomena might also occur isn't like at odds with that. So just because not walking through the wall in a fully realized manner as a devilishly handsome red devil with horns and a fancy cape doesn't mean that you can't see something with physical eyes, right? And so crucially here, it's often talking about a thing shadowy in the stone. And this is, we should be clear that this is coming from a very particular attitude towards how spirits should be worked with, that they need to be commanded, because if you don't command them, they won't work as hard. That you won't get your results as quickly. And it's a very, not just antagonistic, but a very colonial take on the world, that this is here for me to tell it what to do. So that's where we're getting at this notion of like seeing something in the stone. And that's not just in scrying, that's like while one is conjuring, a sense of like something is moving in the stone, or through the stone, or across the stone. The play of light on surfaces, those kinds of things. As well as explicitly staring into a scrying stone and having these visionary experiences.
When we talk about experience and wanting to experience things, the point's been made in the past by other guests on the show that one should really judge magic by its results. And I remember, I think it was John King who mentioned that there are some people, especially when they first start out in magical practice, who are so thirsty for an experience that the devil himself could show up and strike the person down, and they would die with a smile on their face because at least they know that they had an experience and something else happened. And that you should really instead, I think John said, if you really want an experience, do drugs, because it's, I think the way John phrased it was, it's cheaper and you won't have to put on as much, regalia, and you can enjoy stuff. But if you want results and efficacy, engage in magic. And I think he touched on that in Imperial Arts a little bit, but can you share about that? Like, is there a tension between experience and results? Is having an expectation of an experience a good thing, or should it be something that should be mitigated a little bit or truncated, or should there be an experiential aspect in ritual?
I mean, there is going to be an experiential component, right? There's notions of simpatico, right? There's ideas that I would challenge a notion that sort of a false Stoic idea that one should be, completely emotionless, for instance, while performing ritual, that one must have all your wits about you and command in this very sort of Vulcan manner, right? Star Trek Vulcans, not Hephaestus Vulcan. It seems to me that frequently cultivating certain passions is actually operatively useful, and with those passions comes an experience, that spirits are stirred by a great turbulence of passion, right? We should bear in mind that a pre-modern humoral view says that the self is actually kind of porous, and that not only does, an angry person see the world through an angry lens, they're also actually leaking angry virtues out into the world. And likewise, those angry virtues, or particularly those melancholy virtues, are attracting certain spirits as well. Agrippa says melancholy has such a great force of attraction, this kind of black hole gravity of the grave, that unclean spirits are attracted to it. And he also says it's so powerful, even celestial spirits can be attracted to it, to the extent that, sad, melancholy people overcome with black bilious overabundance can become possessed, because that force of their experience, their emotional experience and expression, is bringing those spirits in. Sometimes it's said to feed on that melancholy. I think here of giving spirits blood offerings as well. What are we doing when we're feeding them? Sometimes it seems some of these operations, the blood that's given is directly after one has phlebotomized ill humors from oneself. So you've literally drained all of the toxicity out of your system, and then you've offered it to these spirits, it seems, some of the time. I think there's definitely an experience that's happening, but I think one also needs to make sure that the experience is appropriate to the results one is after. There are instances of knowing when it's working. There are instances of if you've done, there will be nota in various grimoire about if you've done this right, the spirit will do this thing. In one of the Cyprianic work with 4 cardinal kings, it is said that the spirits will bow their head in a particular manner, and you bow your head back. There are salutes which are somewhere between kind of passwords and tips of the hat, acknowledging that you know what you're doing, and also knowing that you can call the spirit to a certain extent to behave according to the result that you want. So I think those things, again, don't have to be separate. You're going to have an experience of some kind. But I get what you mean. If you're just looking for phenomena, I think that happens a lot as well, that people get very interested. I don't want to say distracted. That sounds critical. But become more interested in the phenomena of the light bulb breaking in the temple room, or the faces in the smoke that can be seen in this picture of this incense that was offered, those kinds of things. And those can be useful things if they move you forward, but they can also be things that it can, again, this constant refrain that spirit work can be very scattering of your awareness, and it's important that we bring ourselves back to ourselves, that we stand at this kind of crossroads of all of these options when we do magic, and the idea is to not just balance on the knife point of that choice or chance or change, but to pick a path and to move forward in some way, and to orient ourselves, but then to navigate and to chart and to navigate those charts that we set. Right, so this notion of centering oneself, what are the experiences that bring you back to yourself in order to pursue those results more thoroughly, is part of the ongoing work, right?
I was indeed sloppy in how I phrased that question exactly. Of course, there's always an experiential aspect to properly worked magic, but I loved how you mentioned that in terms of that there is a benefit to cultivating certain passions and experientially having, I was going to say experientially experiencing, but
yeah, it's tricky, right? Phenomenology of that sort. Yeah. It's also a sign of spirit contact, right? I mean, look at some of Liber Juratus, which gets found in the Spirit Spotter's Guide that you find in the fourth book of Occult Philosophy, where it says, when mercurial spirits turn up, that you will feel fearful, that when you're working with solar spirits, you'll start to sweat, that there are physiological and psychological responses to the presence of spirits, right? That those things aren't just responses to the presence, they kind of are emblematic of the presence in some sense. Being able to pay attention to our emotions is just as important as being able to pay attention to our thoughts. And in the same way that spirit contact can feel like something rifling through your memories, and in this kind of Proustian way, being like, why am I thinking about that time I was 7 and I saw that dog completely unbidden? And likewise, why am I suddenly furious for no real good reason? And being able to notice when the passions and the thoughts we're having aren't necessarily ours.
One of the things that I mention to people, I'd love your thoughts on this, is I kind of share, that historically, the very fact that Dee needed or employed Kelly as a scryer, the very fact that we have 2 scryers here in the Excellent Book, shows that different people have also a natural disposition or natural tendency towards the perception of spiritual phenomena or esoteric manifestation, and that the very fact that magicians or operators work with scryers shows that phenomena or signs or the experience of experience might manifest to one person differently, if at all, compared to another person.
Yeah, even if you have the ability to do both, you might not necessarily have the ability to do both at the same time.
Exactly.
Right? That one person is recording, but another person needs to be there to work out what to do next. There's an easy answer, right? There's one person to pay attention to the experience, and there's one person to pay attention to the results, and to keep us on track, to find out what we actually set out to do, and to find out and to achieve, as well as what, spirits then said, actually, we need to talk about this first, or, actually this is more interesting, or look at this shiny thing, whether that's distracting or genuinely trying to teach us and break down why what we're asking is more complicated than we thought.
Can you share, Dr. L., in terms of how these operations concluded? On the 6th of April, 1567, there was a final recorded vision where John Davis returned to Solomon's house as part of an operation that appears to last most of the day, after which he brings Gilbert a book written by St. Luke, presumably transcribed from the crystal. This book of St. Luke, however, appears to have been lost. And I guess the question would be, can you share with the listeners, after this ended on the 6th of April, 1567, after these formal experiments ended, can you share with us what happened after that, and kind of the legacy of the Excellent Book of Magicke, and, the legacy of Gilbert and Davis?
By that point, that's the phrase, I send my boy to the House of Solomon, and he goes and picks me a book off the tree, and then brings it back. But then it's lost. And so there's a perpetual angle here around, how physical are these books? How much is one to read the writing from something in vision, and how much is one writing it out, right? And the term book here could be incredibly short, a treatise or a couple pages, or indeed a tome. But beyond the idea of how physical they are and whether this is lost, there's a sense of what's occurring when it's transmitted, and just because it's transmitted and received. Clearly what they're doing is they're engaging in this visionary process. I don't want to say path working, but it looks like this visionary experience of going to this place. You'll see certain things through the forest, and then you'll get to Solomon's house, and then you have these sigils that you have to put in the correct keyholes, and then it will open up, and you have the tree, and you go through the door, and then you pick the book. What does it mean to lose this text? It's tantalizing, in short. Certainly it seems to have empowered them to do what they wanted to do, which is, go around exploring and conquering the world. Gilbert receives his knighthood in 1570, becomes a member of Parliament for a little bit, becomes an investor in some other maritime schemes, a lot of which fail. There's an expedition to Greenland, which John Dee was also kind of a funder or a patron of. They try briefly to establish an English colony in Newfoundland, and Gilbert gets sunk by pirates in 1583. off the Azores, and he apparently refuses to leave the ship. It was said that he has this strange confidence that he won't die, that death happens to other people, not to him. And apparently he goes down screaming and cursing as the ship sinks and he drowns. Davies also gets killed by pirates near Singapore in 1605. There's not necessarily a pleasant end to them. I'm not saying that they died in the end, but they also died in some particularly violent manners. Certainly it seems Gilbert, at the least, is kind of obstinate. It's kind of suggested, because some people survived the shipwreck, that he could have got away if he wanted to. The suggestion seems to be that he just thought it wouldn't happen to him. He had this certainty. Personally, I think we can ascribe to this notion of a bunch of very senior spirits telling him he was going to be a saint. So in part, the legacy is one of coming a cropper of pirates on the high seas. The wider legacy is that it got contained in the compilation, if you like, of manuscripts in additional 36674, which has a variety of grimoire texts, from a version of the Didygromantia to a couple versions of the Key of Solomon to various other texts. And so it's kind of sat there for a while and occasionally been referenced in passing by a variety of historians. And it's one of the things that, both as a necromancer and a spiritual worker for others and a historian, I'm particularly excited to have so many people get access to this through working with Peter and Alkistis of Scarlet Imprint. And it's something Phil and I have talked about a fair bit, about what is it going to mean to breathe new life into these old bones. I'm very excited for that legacy to not be over yet.
To that point, Dr. Al, what are some of the other projects and other things that you're working on? I know you mentioned a little bit ago about, editing specific pieces that will be published later on, but what would you like the listeners to know in terms of not only upcoming projects and perhaps classes that you might offer, but also just general things that you're thinking about and areas of esoteric exploration?
I'm currently working on the anthology for the International Necromancy Consortium with my co-editor at the Folk Necromancy and Transmission series of Revelor Press, with Jesse Hathaway Diaz, who's also my co-host of the podcast, the occasional podcast we do, Radio Free Golgotha. That's a conference that's happening down in New Orleans in March of this year, and there will be, in time, proceedings from that, articles that are already coming in. So we'll be putting together an anthology on various forms of necromantic theory and practice that I've been very inspired to work with some really brilliant people with. Very excited about that. I'll be down there and delivering a talk on a practical syllabus of early modern English and, British and European necromancy, based off a quote from a dictionary maker, Thomas Blaut, in 1661, writes not only a definition of necromancer, but then provides all of these really amazingly useful criteria of what it is necromancers actually do, built around dream incubation, around food practices, around particular clothes, incense, words. And so that essay is part of an ongoing work. It's both practical on my part and also inspiring further research into dream incubation and a variety of other very practical ways of working with the dead to empower our own magic. There's necromancy afoot. There's also, I continue to teach classes through Wolf and Goat, which is half of my good friend and colleague Jesse Hathaway Diaz and his business partner Troy Chambers, continuing to teach webinar classes with them, most frequently on one of my favorite forms of divination, geomancy, and exploring geomancy as both a divination system and also as pulling the sorcery out of the sortilege, so to speak, and talking about geomantic magic as well. I'm going to be having an upcoming class on remediation, on how to read a shield chart, not just to say what's going to happen or what you should do about it, but how you should secure blessings and avoid potential pitfalls. So I'm continuing to work on those, continuing to edit with Revelor Press and the Folk Necromancy and Transmission series. There's some nascent works on some other grimoires that have been a bit undervalued. Work with St. Cyprian and on various early modern Cyprianic texts, specifically those to do with the Four Kings, continues. I taught a webinar course earlier last year on the Four Kings, and they will probably do that again at some point this year, presenting a variety of historical sources and also some of my own experiments that have been successful and I'm happy to pass on. also starting to speak to more students and folks both in class and also privately as one-to-one coaching to facilitate their own experimentations and empowerments of their own magical practices. Continuing to see clients for divination and for spell work, continuing to make talismans of various sorts, continuing to try and find time to write in between all this stuff, and some excellent travel opportunities coming up as well. So this year is one of already having hit the ground running, and I've been delighted to meet new store owners of amazing, witch shops and ritual spaces, and continue to engage in a variety of communities and practitioners. So I'm very grateful to get to do my job, and to occasionally get to have lovely chats with yourself and other podcasts as well, where I get to bang on about this stuff.
I'm also hearing from other fellow magicians and fans of you that you're going to be in Omaha. I mean, you really are like the traveling magician. It's so cool.
I'm very, very fortunate. It's a delight. Yes, I'm very excited to be coming to Omaha to talk about necromancy, surprisingly, as well as geomancy, also surprisingly, and cunning craft as well. And there'll be more details about that. I'm very excited, and I've been in talks with some great shops and people there. Thank you particularly to Charlie Elorezzi and to Papa Newt, who was a friend I met at the Mile High Conjure Gala last year. We'll be coming to Omaha and hanging out with some cool magicians and talking about some cool magic and nerding out about grimoires and swapping best practice tips and things. Magic can often be, even in communities, a somewhat solitary affair, and I think it's very important that we continue to talk to each other and we continue to find ways to. Some things aren't for sharing, as we've talked about. There are ritual significances to silence about certain things, that pacts are kept in place, and that we hold to our word. It's also important that we recognize that we're social beings, and that we, sometimes need to, if not step back from the circle, at least acknowledge that the circle extends wider than we might think, and that these are useful things, that we are in part social beings. Keeping each other honest is an important feature, and seeing if other people are getting similar results. Not that we should overly rely on the validation of others, of course, but we learn more through collaboration than we do through competition.
Dr. Al, too, you mention in your essay a lot about one of the entities, we shall say, who is engaged with in this excellent book, and that would be, of course, Roger Bacon. And you mention about Roger Bacon and his writings, his own evolution, and then also his relationship to necromancy. Can you just give us a broad overview for the listeners who will pick up a copy of this book, and maybe it's their first time encountering Bacon at this level? What are some of the just general things that you'd love people to know about?
Sure, yeah. Roger Bacon was a 13th century, what we'd call a natural philosopher. We might call him an occult philosopher. I think that's fair as well. He's certainly interested in alchemy. He's also very interested in optics. And again, anyone that's looked at Dee and his interest in optics, both in terms of like how does light work, the importance that light plays theologically in early modern Christianity and various other practices, but also like the more practical magical applications of astrological magic in relation to understanding how the rays of the stars work and what they empower. What interests me about Bacon is that he's another example of a practitioner, a learned man who is engaged in what will, what later be called occultism, right? It's not a 13th century term, to my knowledge. That comes a little later, putting an ism on it. But he's interested in the natural philosophy of the naturally magical cosmos, shall we say. And upon his death, slightly before it, but definitely after it, he starts to develop this far more sinister reputation. In the same way that we may be familiar with how, dear Uncle Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa kind of goes from being an occult philosopher who, albeit is, also runs a cropper of the law a couple times, into this sinister black magician. And it seems to be this pattern that happens a lot. And I'm really interested in this, what Kierkegaard has described as an inverse hagiography, right? That upon death, someone who is regarded as like very knowledgeable about magical things, the rumors kind of instantly start to circulate, and the denigration, right? The blackening of their reputation seems to happen. We see this happening to Dee in his lifetime, seems to kick in and to kind of develop them as the shadow is pooled and begins to cast longer than the body of work that they left in life. One of the ways this happens, crucially, is through attributing various grimoires to them. So we mentioned Baconian grimoires, such as De Nigromantia. This arguably comes from the fact that it is known that Bacon wrote a work about necromancy, on necromancy, right, or on black magic, if it's necromancy rather than necromancy, but it's not necessarily terribly well known what he wrote about it. And so this provides this little keyhole for a spirit of doubt and suspicion and kind of spiritual paranoia to steal in and to start saying, well, we don't know what he was doing in his basement, though, do we? This sounds kind of like a little puerile, maybe, but like that sense of this kind of paranoia or something. But it's something that keeps happening again and again to famous magicians. In death become infamous black magicians of various sorts. The texts attributed to Bacon range from stuff that turns his optics into something more sinister. He's said to have a scrying mirror, and so he's important for the history of scrying. Crucially, one of the things that he's said to have done that's proved how devilish he was is allowing people to scry to see their sons away at sea or at war, like parents worried about their kids abroad. And the idea that this is like demonstrable of his like sinister nature is kind of bizarre to me. But this idea that he sees further than he should and that he encourages other people to do the same has obvious has political undertones to it, along with the fact that his name gets attributed to a whole kind of subset of grimoires that often have this feature of lots of circles and the occasional sense of offering wax effigies of animals in a variety of ways. Whether or not he actually did this is somewhat unlikely, but again, when we get to a concept of working with the dead who might also be related to or in part pacted to the devilish, then we start to deal with the splitting of the ghost of a famous occult philosopher also casting this shadow or this shade of a black magician that one might also be able to work with. That death and reputation and historiography provide this prism by which we might summon and work with a patron, albeit a mythic one, of a particular book of forbidden magics of various sorts. And I think this is some fascinating material, as Peter Gray of the Scarlets has said before. What's important is for us to understand the importance of both our history and our myth, and not to confuse them, but to, as I've been thinking about it, to serve with both hands and see how one informs the other in terms of a combination of responsible practice and empowered practice.
We do have a listener question from Douglas from the What Magic Is This podcast, and he's saying, quote, Dr. Al has talked many times about patron spirits and patron saints, things that are always a good idea for those dealing with certain grimoires and manuscripts. But does he have any opinion on using real historical figures as patrons for this work? Yes, many saints were real people, but what about, say, using someone as recent as the last 500 years? Let's even go so far as an example where perhaps a hapless magician feels some kind of kinship with a figure from the 16th century, an explorer who was important in claiming a segment of land in this hapless magician's current country of residence. Would this be advantageous in any way, Dr. Al?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to be clear, when I talk about working with dead magicians, which Jesse has begun suggesting that people should take a shot every time I do, that I'm not just talking about like mythic or semi-mythic magicians like Solomon or Adam as they turn up in the Excellent Book, but also a variety of, for me, 17th century geomancers and astrologer physicians. They're on record, many of them, with summoning spirits and patron angels and other spirits to help them do their work of consulting and attempting to heal and remedy the problems of their clients. I am a professional worker as well, and calling in my forefathers and my foremothers of cunning practice is immensely important to me and offers me guidance and support. So yeah, as both a historian and a necromancer, I think that's absolutely a validity in exploring that.
We do, Dr. Al, also have another listener question from Dennis Poisson, who's asking, what drew Dr. Cummins' attention to an excellent book in the first place? Knowing what he knows, would Dr. Al say that the method used by Humphrey Gilbert and John Davies was heavily inspired by any particular previously existing well-known system? And did that that in turn inspire others to his knowledge?
This is a great question in terms of getting to kind of try and summarize some of the stuff that we've talked about today, really, like the combination of utilizing the kind of typical things that one is encouraged to do in early modern magic, or what early modern magic should look like, right? It should probably have a stone, it should probably have a series of prayers, it should probably have some forms of purification or of living well. It also has a procedural experimentalism to it. You receive a prayer, so you do that prayer until you receive other instruction, then you should do those other things, and you kind of carve your own steps up the mountain, so to speak. Again, this is something that we've touched on, as I've referred to as the tradition of innovation that we find. On the one hand, again, to use the example of the good Dr. D, on the one hand, he is utilizing grimoire material that he's not just channeling in order to channel material, right? Various components of his angelic operations are from previously existing grimoire material, but he's also not dressing up like a Roman or like a Mesopotamian, right? He's also pulling out relatively new material, new sets of spirits to work with, who aren't regarded as like creating those spirits, but being revealed. He's seeking knowledge and conversation with the highest of various forms. He's looking for apocalypse in the sense of the unveiling of the world, right, and understanding what's going on there. And so they've got themselves an attitude to magic that does both, right? They're drawing on some attitudes towards doing magic. Again, this idea of like, have a couple good books to call by, right? Yeah, sure, you can use some Girata stuff, what works for you, but then also in order to receive information that's new to you, at least. And again, there's the experimentalism coming in.
Dr. Al, we also have a listener question from Cash, who is saying, I was already thinking of buying this when I saw it on Scarlet Imprint site last week, and of course we'll make sure to link to it. And Cash is asking Dr. Al, please ask Dr. Al if he thinks the fact that all these prominent Elizabethan-era men seem to have known each other and practiced magic implies that they might have done more magic than is written in the manuscripts and records we currently have, especially considering the exceptional things many of them did later in their careers.
I think so, yes. There are hints of this throughout the early modern period, especially by the 17th century. I think there's a couple points here. One of the kind of like things I don't want to sound like a cheap shot is that we definitely have better records of nobility and those entering the elite and working through the Queen's courts, right? We just generally have better records of that stuff because people tend not to care as much about poor people in terms of the elites are the ones writing these things down. We certainly have reports in passing and in correspondence of mentioning bits and pieces of things that people are doing. A little later in the 17th century, the autobiography of William Lilly, the famous astrologer, also details, at the behest of his patron Elias Ashmole, that he lists a bunch of the magicians that he's met. Ashmole seems to have this real bee in his bonnet about wanting to understand a lineage of English magic and wants to know about what other magicians were doing. And so Lilly recounts many of these stories, including things like Sir Kenelm Digby asking Lilly's teacher, his magical teacher, John Evans, to summon a spirit for him, to see what it looks like. Again, that thing of like a curiosity of this stuff. And Lilly gives examples of how the operation ends up going a bit sideways for various reasons, partly because Evans forgets to offer fumigation for the spirits, and this vexes them. And so they, as I say, it goes very sideways. Again, as we talked about, writing things down is a little dangerous sometimes. We only know about many of Elias Ashmole's magical operations in terms of casting of astrological sigils, and even working with the 16 good angels of physic from the tables of practice of Dee's Enochian or angelical material, because C.H. Jocelyn was able to crack the cipher that they were recorded in, right? So there's definitely a sense. Same with, it's said about Richard Napier, that his operations with the Archangel Raphael were like, he seems to have commented or certainly intimated that he was doing more than he wrote down, which is very little. And more work on the history of that has been forthcoming, and very recently I'm very excited to see more of that being done, and more of the idea that there are networks of professional magicians who are talking to each other and attempting to refine their art, whether that's through studying the case files of their clients' nativity charts or geomantic charts that they set to try and further sharpen and refine their art and their efficacy of their practice and the achievement of the results thereafter. So I think that's very important, and I suspect, yes, silence is both politically expedient and occasionally ritually significant. I suspect a lot of these folks were doing a little more magic, or some of them a lot more magic than we can kind of prove at the moment.
You've made so many good points about the kind of different valences that magicians have operated in, whether it's individual operations or whether it is specific engagements with spirits, physical manifestation, maybe getting a sign of a presence. And to all of those points, we have a listener question from Damian Gordon who's asking, while I haven't read the manuscript yet, I understand that in the Diary of the Operations, they conjure and speak to the shades of some people of dubious actual historical existence, such as Solomon or even Adam. In these instances, I'm curious who or what Dr. Al thinks these particular spirits are.
Yeah, I mean, this again sort of recalls the trouble with that caller ID of conjuration, right? How do you know the spirit is the spirit that it claims to be? Often this is through testing in various means, not all of which are antagonistic, but that is it able to do and to demonstrate knowledge, and does it quack like a duck, right? There are forms of being able to test this. You know, not all phylacteries or lamen or pentacles or seals or sigils are about literal protection, or we might say that protection is a broader category than to make sure that demons can't hurt you, not just with their talons or their foul breath that many demons seem to have, but also with their lies. And so we are doing a variety of things to ensure that only the right spirits for the job are able to turn up. In terms of more directly, who do I think they are? I don't think working with a spirit of Adam is made less effective by Adam being mostly mythic, right? There must have been a first set of people, or there's a spectrum between when we weren't human of various sorts, and as we're discovering, archaeology is showing that there's been a variety of hominids, right, that were kind of coexisting. But a tracing back to a first ancestor is, I think, an incredibly powerful mythic locus by which we can perform a variety of other forms of ancestry. And again, the stories that cohere and that spirits cohere and wall in and out of is really, really useful. Many traditions have a sense that a spirit is made up of a variety of things. They're not just an individual. They are a combination of, everyone that died at this crossroads while a crow crowed at midnight while lightning struck a tree, while this concatenation, this torsion of things, as people continued to appeal to this spirit and provide a space for, we can talk about like the accruing of egregores, but I also think, we are magicians that and thus deal with the mythic as much as the historical, and so I don't think it's a significant problem that the spirit of someone of dubious historicity or dubious actual historical existence is turning up. The trick is to make sure that if they claim to be Adam, can they do what Adam does? And that's, again, about ensuring that we are behaving both responsibly and efficaciously in our ritual work.
Damien is also asking Dr. Al, have you, Dr. Al, or anyone you know practiced the method outlined in this manuscript in the Excellent Booke? And Damien's asking if there's any results or advice that you might have for those interested in following the same method that you could share.
Sure, yeah. I desperately don't want to play I've got a secret and be smug with information that I sadly cannot reveal. I really don't want to do that. I will definitely say that I work pretty extensively with the Four Kings, and certainly the practices that I see in the Excellent Booke suggesting that one work with several stones, one for each of the kings, and that one might suspend those or set those on the walls that correspond to the four directions is incredibly useful. It also correlates with other grimoire material, especially Cyprianic material around the four cardinal kings, that also suggests that they come to what get called their chairs in one invocation outside of the Excellent Booke. That one, again, as Giulio Odi has pointed out, we call to them. We don't necessarily literally bind them every time that we want to do anything under their aegis. We're using them as a presence that can bring forth something else, or that can in some way cohere or call forth or even bind or charge these spirits. But this idea of a chair that they might come and sit in doesn't have to be a literal chair, but like a fetish or a talisman of some kind in which they're not bound into, but that they can occupy at the four quarters has been exceptionally useful for my practice. Certainly the incorporation of dreaming, of working more significantly with a couple of the same tutelary spirits that turn up, I would also say that taking the imprecation when you're told to not talk too much about your own particular practice for periods of time is also one that you should take seriously. And that this will also not necessarily, in the same way that Baal doesn't necessarily have to turn up as a cat or a toad or a man, right? These are, I think, heraldic, emblematic descriptions of the nature of the spirit in some way, but he might appear in a different guise. Likewise, the visions that you might have in these scrying operations are not necessarily going to be exactly like these, but there may be some very interesting parallels. On a good day, all of these works and some of the things that we can pull out of this idea that the visions show how the instructions of the grimoire cohere and are imparted and received, that it's a record of your own practice, that grimoire magic is, yes, about like obeying particular rules about some things sometimes, but it's also about working in the way that you are instructed to, and that may in time become rather more, I don't want to say idiosyncratic, but rather more individuated to your practice and your courts of spirits and your strengths and your blind spots. And so, again, that's not to say you can throw out all the rules and just do whatever you want. That's categorically not what I'm saying. But you should not be surprised if in time after you've done the initial operations, the way many people frame this in terms of like building the phone that then rings and you pick up, and that's when you receive the additional instructions. Like the initial conjurations with spirits is the start of the work, not the complete work. When you start to receive instructions and tuition and experience from doing this stuff, that you shouldn't discount that, but you should also treat it critically and evaluate it, I would say, with good divination of a variety of sorts, and confirm what's happening, and then pursue the path that's being shown to you.
Is there anything else, Dr. Al, that we haven't touched on yet you'd like to touch on, or anything else that you'd like to let our listeners know about, either about the Excellent Book or anything else?
Oh, gosh. I mean, if I haven't made it clear enough, I'm immensely grateful and glad to have worked with Phil on this, and to have worked with Peter and Alkistis of Scarlet Imprint. I'm very excited to get to share the fruits of our labours as well with folks. That's the main thing I want to emphasize, really, at this point. Dr.
Alexander Cummins, thank you so much for, again, taking the time and sharing your time and your wisdom and coming on the podcast today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Alex. It's always a pleasure to chat to you.
Listeners, how wonderful, elucidating, and refreshing to hear Dr. Alexander Cummins share about this incredible, mysterious, and powerful dynamic duo of scryer and magician Humphrey Gilbert and John Davies. Now, Dr. Cummins' observations on magical innovation in these techniques and how it represents an evolution in the time period's approach to magical engagement is a total reminder to myself, and I hope to you too, that we should always respect tradition, but we should never let it become a limiting factor to our own individuated practices and rituals. So thank you so much for listening. If you are so inspired, you can always check out Glitchbottle on Patreon. That's patreon.com/glitchbottle. And you can always subscribe to Glitchbottle on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. Oh, and leaving a good review or stars or anything on Apple Podcasts and Spotify is always totally most welcome. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.